Good morning. I'd like to welcome people to our next show on Behind the Fiscal Curtain, where we try to explain the fiscal issues that have arisen in New York State over the last, 30 or 40 years. And we are honored today to have former Governor Paterson join us to talk about his time as governor, which I happen to be a budget director for a portion of his governorship. And it was a pretty interesting time in terms of the fiscal condition of the state. We have been plagued by late budgets. And I think Governor Paterson was able to navigate an incredibly difficult period, but I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. So we'll get to all of that. So welcome, Governor Paterson, and thank you for doing this.
Well, Bob, it's great to be here, and you came in at a very critical time in the state's history. The fiscal effects of the economic crisis that began in 2008 were hardest hit by New York, even though there were states like California, Arizona, Illinois, I can name a few others, who were fiscally mismanaged, but did not get hurt as much as New York did, because 22.5% of our revenues come from Wall Street's profits, and the 2008 crash was a Wall Street event.
It really was. And in fact, even last night, we had some Empire State Fellows, some young people coming into state government who don't really understand the impact of kind of these events, even though in my mind, they weren't that long ago, but an interesting period. But maybe we can start out a little bit about you and your background. I think as I get older, I realize that people don't always know the background of some of our governors. And I know you came from a little bit of a political family. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, my father, Basil Paterson, was elected to the New York State Senate in 1965. He ran for lieutenant governor in 1970, and he ran with Arthur Goldberg, who had stepped down from the Supreme Court of the United States to run for governor. Apparently, President Lyndon Baines Johnson got Goldberg to do this so he could appoint the first African-American to the United States Supreme Court, who was Thurgood Marshall. But I'm going to tell you what, I wouldn't have cared what the historic event was. If I was on the Supreme Court, he could not have talked me from getting off of there. And Goldberg was a well-known diplomat. He'd been an ambassador to the UN. He had been a foreign policy advisor, very active in government, and the worst candidate you'd ever see in your life. He just didn't connect well with people. He couldn't look them in the eye too well. And so in the primary, Goldberg narrowly became the gubernatorial candidate, defeating an upstate industrialist by the name of Howard Samuels. And my father beat the Huntington Town supervisor, Jerome Ambrose, by 73-27. And the heads of the Goldberg campaign, while they liked running an African-American for lieutenant governor, didn't want the public to actually know that that's what they were doing. So they never put my father's picture in any of the ads. But after the primary results, suddenly they were focusing on him even more than the candidate, because Governor Rockefeller seemed to be unbeatable. And in that case, he was unbeatable. And one of the events from that campaign that I remember fondly was we were watching TV and the news came on, and Governor Rockefeller announces his campaign for governor. Now, if he did anything like this, if someone did something like this today, they would just undergo so much public scrutiny, they probably wouldn't be able to run. He had the press conference because the argument was that he'd been there for 12 years and he was getting older now and he wasn't focusing as much as he used to. So he has the press conference at Jones Beach in Long Island in a bathing suit, and he has 10 to 12 women standing behind him in bikinis, and he actually takes questions from the press And then he goes, I'm tired of these questions. He runs in the water and they all run in and jump in the water after him. I mean, it looked like something that Hugh Hefner would do. And I looked at my father and I said, I think you all just lost. So he went on to become the Secretary of State of New York under Governor Hugh Carey. And then he became Deputy Mayor for Labor Relations to Ed Koch. And he became a labor negotiator. And then when he went back to private practice, he represented Union Local 1199, the Teachers Union, the Transport Workers Union. So he was, what would we say, a tough act to follow?
Yeah. So when did you get in? I knew of you when you became minority leader in the state Senate, but when did you get into politics?
So I got into politics in a way that was just purely coincidental. I was working in the Queens District Attorney's office, and you had a certain period of time to pass the bar exam. But I was having difficulty with the material because not that many blind people take the bar exam. And so I was sort of putting off taking this exam. And then finally, I left the office and I worked in the borough president's campaign of former Mayor David Dinkins in 1985. I was his fundraiser. And one night there was a political club in Harlem that was having a candidates night, but they had made it clear they didn't like Mayor Dinkins. He was running against Assemblyman Jerry Nadler for borough president. And this club wanted him to come. And this one night, Dinkins is like, you know, I'm not going to go there and get insulted for an hour and a half. And he asked his surrogate, the person who took his place when he couldn't speak, to go. And he said he wasn't going to be insulted either. So they send me, the fundraiser, who really doesn't know the issues in the borough as well as they do. And I got the idea of what it would be like to be inquisitioned from about 7 p.m. that evening till a little after 8:30. And finally, I think the convener of this meeting, who had previously been convicted for stealing cheese from an anti-poverty program and was affectionately known in Harlem as the cheese thief. The cheese thief stops the meeting and says, listen, young man, I don't think you should get too upset. You're not the person we wanted to talk to this evening. You're basically getting the antagonism that was intended for your candidate. And you should go back and tell him the next time that there's a meeting that you had, that he'd better be there. And I said, I'll do that, sir. And then this older woman sitting in the middle of the room raises her hand for the 4th time. She has already assaulted me 3 times. I see no reason why when you're dead, your body should be burned. But I welcomed her question. And she said, first, I want to tell you, I'm not voting for your candidate because he didn't have the decency to come here. I said, I understand that, ma'am. That's your prerogative. And little would I know that the next thing she said changes my life. She said, but young man, I really admired how you sat there and even though you knew you were being insulted and calmly answered all of our questions. So when you get old enough one day and run for office, I'm going to help you. And she started clapping and I got a standing ovation. Now, Bob, the only thing I had to do was to hold back tears because I can't believe this is happening.
Right.
Well, 3 weeks later, the state senator passed away, and Percy Sutton, who had been the former borough president and the head of intercity broadcasting, called me up, and he was kind of a mentor for me. And he said, "Run for that seat. You won't win, but people are going to see something in you, and it'll pay off later." The only thing he got wrong was that I did win. And I took him to lunch, and I asked him, why did he suggest that I run for the office? And he said, well, apparently you made an appearance in some political club. And as soon as the senator died, people in the club called me up and said, go get them to hire that kid. He's too young right now, but one day he could be something. And that's how my career started.
That's fascinating.
Now you'll notice that I became governor just as coincidentally as I got into politics.
I was going to ask you about that.
What I would say is I have a knack for being in the right place at the right time. I also have a knack for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And we'll go through some of those stories before we're finished.
So when you got to the Senate, when did you become minority leader?
I became minority leader in 2002, and it was another one of these sort of coincidental situations where one of the other senators had established that the minority leader at the time had funneled money to one of his opponents, which is like the big no-no in politics. You're supposed to be on the same team. And he went around recruiting people to take the leadership away from the leader at the time, whose name was Martin Connor. And the members said to him, "You're right that we need a new leader, but you never talked to us. And therefore you better find somebody else if you want to replace him." And so he came to me and asked me to run for leader. And I wasn't particularly comfortable about this, but I was talked into it. And the next thing I knew, I was the minority leader of the Senate, the first non-white or male leader in New York's legislative history. And all that happened in a very short period of time.
It's fascinating. And then Eliot Spitzer asked you to be lieutenant governor. How did that happen?
Well, Eliot Spitzer was back and forth about who the lieutenant governor could possibly be. And he and I were having a lunch one day, and he said, well, I said to him, "I get the feeling that you want to ask me to run. And why would I run for lieutenant governor? Because I think when I win a few more seats from the Republicans, I'm going to be the majority leader of the Senate. And, the majority leader of the Senate is the second most powerful leader in Albany.
Right.
Lieutenant governor carries the governor's coat around." And Spitzer said to me, "Well, I wouldn't want to be rejected." He said, "But if there's anything that you really could think of that would enable you to be my lieutenant governor, I'd like you to be that person." So I came back to him the next day and I said, "I think that our Senator Hillary Clinton is going to run for president in 2008. And I don't see anyone that can beat her. And when she wins, she'll become the president. You've got to fill the Senate seat. If I'm your lieutenant governor, I would hope you would fill it with me."
Wow.
And he made a statement that I think he should have listened to more than I did. He said, "Stay out of trouble and you've got it." But I guess his way of promoting me was he cut out the middleman and had to resign himself. And that's how I became governor.
I want to jump to the fiscal crisis, but you raised such interesting points in New York's recent history because you ended up having to make that decision.
Yes. And Mayor Bloomberg and some other people said to me, "Albany is a rat's nest." That's what they called it. And they said, the budget, the deficit is nearly $20 billion. All you're going to do is get hurt. Here's your chance. Appoint yourself to the Senate and get out. There were two reasons I didn't do it. Number one was I looked up governors who appointed themselves United States Senator, and I noticed that 9 of the last 10 that had done it lost when they ran for the Senate. In other words, they were there, and when they had to run for re-election, they all got beaten, except for Happy Chandler, the former baseball commissioner, who in 1940 appointed himself as senator when he was governor, and he sustained the challenge. So I thought, I don't know if I'm going to break that streak. The other reason was that there was a significant issue in the New York State Senate because the Democrats had a 1-vote majority. There were also 4 Democrats who called themselves the Four Amigos, and they would shift back and forth based on whoever they thought could bring them power. They would inevitably be termed by me the Four Inmates because they all got convicted of crimes before I left office. And I was afraid that they would do what they inevitably did do by removing the Senate Majority Leader by having a few of them go over and change the amount of senators so that they brought the majority back to the Republicans. So I thought that it might work out for me, but the state was in a situation where we could not have a protracted struggle over who the acting governor is going to be, because I had no lieutenant governor. So we couldn't have that struggle in the middle of the major fiscal crisis that we had in the 2008-2009 budget, the 2009-2010 budget.
So I think this is all an interesting lead up because you clearly had a long background in New York State politics. But again, I don't think anything would have prepared people for what happened in after the financial crisis in 9/10, and you inherited the governorship. What struck you when you initially got there about, how you were going to start or begin to deal with the issues around this crisis?
In preparation for our discussion today, Bob, I went back to June of 2015 and I watched a speech that I gave to the Rockefeller Institute and to Albany Law School up in Albany. And so what I'm about to tell you is what yesterday I heard myself say back at that time, which was that in the fourth quarter of 2008, the 40th largest corporations and banks paid to New York in income taxes $531 million in the last quarter of 2007. In the last quarter of 2008, 1 year later, right as we're trying to attack this fiscal crisis, they paid 72 million, 14% of what they paid the year before. By the time we get to 2009, in June of 2009, the 16 largest banks that had paid $173 million in taxes in the first 2 quarters of 2009, 2008, in 2009, they paid $5 million. They paid only 3% of the taxes they paid before. So New York was really going off the cliff. And our projected budget deficit, at the time I passed the budget 2 weeks after I came into office in 2008, the budget projection for the 2009-2010 budget was $5 billion. By July, the projection was $10 billion, which is why I called a special election of the legislature to close a $4 billion out-year budget gap. Then I tried to bring them back later in 2008 to address the fact that the budget was still growing. They refused to do it, as they're entitled to. They don't have to come back. And the eventual budget deficit was $21.3 billion. And obviously, I did everything to try to close the gap. The Democrats said tax the rich, so I taxed the rich. The Republicans said cut the budget, I cut the budget, and I unified the state. Basically, everybody hated me. And so, but we were able to close that budget. We were able to close it on time, amazingly. But I think the political damage was such that I think I could sense even then that after all of that, it was going to be hard for me to run for re-election. I think if I had been there for a period of time and had established myself as the leader of the state, then I would have been able to do it without the ramifications. But this pretty much started from the first week of my ascending to the executive branch.
No, and I know, and I came into that process a little bit later. And listen, for those viewers who weren't around or weren't experts, I think you're being a little, your humility is showing. I think you definitely inherited probably the worst fiscal crisis up until the COVID crisis that people had faced, and as a brand new governor navigated that process. And then in the next budget cycle, where I think you've already outlined some of the political problems in the Senate, you were really forced to discipline a process. And so this is where the whole question of the governor's executive powers comes in. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, this is where you played a pivotal role, Bob, and I don't know if you remember actually doing this. But in the 2000, and now we're looking at the the budget in 2010, we were late. We weren't able to pass the budget. The legislature wouldn't budge. They would not close the budget deficit within $2 billion. And I remember one of the legislators, who's now the chair of finance in the Senate, Liz Kruger, said to me, well, isn't that close enough? And I said, Senator Kruger, it's not horseshoes. It's the mandate that the budget be balanced. And the budget's really only balanced on 2 days of the year. One is April 1st, when the budget has to be balanced. And then it's theoretically on December 31st, but no one pays any attention to that part of it. The budget's really never balanced. However, I did not want to leave such a deficit for Governor Cuomo, who I believe was going to be and became my successor at the time. And you, along with Peter Kiernan, my counsel, we had a meeting, and you said that in the extenders, and extenders, of course, are the way you extend government when you aren't able to close the budget, because theoretically, if you can't close the budget deficit, then the government shuts down. So to extend the government at the existing rate, you said to me, and we cut it to the bare bones. We're not giving out anything to anybody. I mistakenly thought that you were saying that we were cutting the budget, and repeated it on NPR in an interview maybe the next afternoon. At that point, you and Peter Kiernan, who was my counsel, flew in from opposite ends of the two doors to my office to tell me, no, you can't do that. That's not what we did. So I said, well, what did we do? You said, we just, usually in extenders, you put a few perks in to kind of aggrandize the legislature and get them to understand that you really want it closed, and a couple of perks that they want, you put them in, but we didn't put any in. That's what I meant by cutting it to the bone. So I said, well, how come we can't put the cuts in the budget? And Peter Kiernan said, well, that's never happened before. And I said, but Peter, that's an Albany answer. So Peter Kiernan and his staff went back and researched, and they found out that when the governor puts the extender in, the legislature must vote up or down on the extender. They can't change it. They can't change the allocations, which in a budget process, the legislature can reduce the governor's appropriations. So if the governor appropriates $150 million to build a complex somewhere, and the legislature doesn't want to do it, they can cut it in half, and the governor can't do anything about it. But in this particular situation, they have to vote it up or down. So we then put a few cuts in the budget, and I'm going to tell you, you should have seen the face of Speaker Sheldon Silver when I delivered that message to him and the Majority Leader John Sampson. In fact, I felt that the Speaker, God rest his soul, had taken advantage of the fact that I was a new governor coming in, and he'd presided over these budgets for the last 16 or 17 years. And so I thought that he got the better of me, but this move was evening out all the things he may have done to me. And he said to me, this is the most naked, political, vicious act I've ever seen in Albany. And I said, I can think of one that's worse. And the Speaker said to me, well, please tell me what that is. And I said, what I'm going to do tomorrow. And but aside from the personality issues that were there, shortly thereafter, I got a phone call from the Attorney General, Andrew Cuomo, who was candidate for governor. And he said, that move was so brilliant. He said, the only bad thing is you're not going to be around to really enforce it, because I'm going to do this every year from now on. And there's really never been a late budget ever since then. Now, in 2016, the governor started to pile almost like half of his legislative program into the extenders. And I think some of the good government groups have complained about that. And then, of course, in 2020, after COVID, he basically put the whole legislative agenda in the budget. But at that point, we were reeling from the effects of the coronavirus, and it probably was actually appropriate to do that. But that will be a continuing struggle between students of history and people who have issues about what the balance of power should be in Albany. But one of the factors that influenced my decision to go ahead with it is that I had read that this institute, the Rockefeller Institute, had put out a report about the governors around the country, and that New York was in the lowest quintile in terms of gubernatorial power. So if the Institute thinks that this was the right thing to do, all of you should know that you were contributors to that process.
Well, I think, I think you took advantage at the time also of the history of the Court of Appeals cases in New York, which had basically said that it was a strong executive budget process. But I don't think any governor had acted up until that time as forcefully as you did in that situation. Can I relay one funny thing about that time? Because I remember, because you mentioned Majority Leader Sampson at the time, and I think the Senate was, the Assembly may have been a problem for you politically with Shelley Silver, but I always thought the Senate was even tougher for you, because you always knew where Shelley Silver was coming from with Sampson. All the things you talked about before were coming out. So I remember one budget meeting where you asked them, tell me, this is before you had gone into this process you described, tell me the 3 things you need to be done. Please tell me each of them. And Shelley Silver mentioned 3 things. And then when John Sampson got to 5, Shelley said to him, that's 5, not 3. And that was kind of the end of it. But I think you sensed, and I remember you saying after, unless we took pretty strong action, this was never gonna, they couldn't finish, I guess is my question to you.
Now, there was a individual who was part of a constitutional convention in 1914, and his name was Warren Stimson. He was kind of one of the Republican reformers of that time. And he had been the Secretary of War to President Taft. He went on to be the Secretary of State to President Hoover. Then he became the Secretary of War to President Roosevelt and Truman. So since he had a lot of experience with war, I guess he knew a lot about the New York legislative process. And he wrote a memorandum before the Constitutional Convention that they did not approve, but eventually they did pass expanded authority for the executive branch in 1926 under Governor Al Smith. And what he said is, we'll forgive him for this. He said one man, but he meant one person, because I don't want Governor Hochul to feel that I repeated that. One person should be staying up all night worrying about the fiscal affairs of the state. And what he meant was, when these kinds of controversies come up, and these legislative leaders are under a lot of pressure because they're just undoing all the promises that they made to their members and that the members made to the public about these great things they're going to do, but we're in a huge fiscal crisis. And recognizing that, I realized that although Senator Sampson probably didn't realize it at the time, the late Speaker Silver realized that I was taking them off the hook. I took the blame for all of the cuts. Then there was absolutely no way I could approve their discretionary member items after cutting some of the serious services, particularly in education, we had to cut $400 million from education to the state. And then we've got these, member items about, very small things, but there were 6,709 discretionary member items in the budget. And I told them I wouldn't approve them. They had this big press conference. And they said, he doesn't care about Little League. He doesn't care about after-school programs. He's not even going to sign these vetoes. He's going to get an auto pen, and that's going to do the signing. So I decided to take every one of the vetoes. We piled them up on a desk.
I was there.
It must have been 6 feet high. And I went through every page and vetoed it. And about a quarter of the way through, I had a wonderful press secretary by the name of Morgan Hook. And he said that he used to be the general manager at a TV station. He said, I want to put a TV camera up and let all the networks take the feed. And they were actually showing this blank screen with myself and Peter Kiernan and the rest of the team, and they would pass the vetoes to me and I'd sign them. And you couldn't hear the things that we were saying to each other, which was a good thing. We signed all those vetoes, and it's the one time I favorably was on the front page of the Times, the Daily News, sounds like a Billy Joel song, and the New York Post the next day, because they just thought that that was a creative to not only sign the vetoes. By the way, I've lost the use of my right hand ever since that situation.
Sitting next to you for that day, I also have a copy of the Daily News where you're on the front page for that.
You do?
I do. And I have to have you sign. I have to have you sign it for me. Yeah. Because it was an amazing kind of period. The other piece I remember, and I thought, and the way the vetoes, I think, got to you was interesting too. And again, I think you're right. I think Speaker Silver understood really the power issue that was going on, but he didn't have a partner either with the Senate. And
Right.
So he, I think, wanted to be finished. And I think you're right. Your description is right. He wanted you to take him off the hook. Until I think they realized when we put the education bill in the hallway and you kind of did it the way you wanted to do it. And I remember it, this part I remember like it was yesterday, they wouldn't even pick up the bills and take them in the office.
No, they left them outside.
They left them outside. And that was the last piece. And when, they were forced to basically pass the budget as you presented it on the education side especially. And you're right, it did have cuts in it. And then, they did have the bill that had the member items in it. And then I think it was 1,600. It was an enormous number of signatures you had to make that day.
Yeah, it was painful.
What do you think the aftermath is to that whole process?
Well, the one thing that I regret is that in 2008, when I first came in, and I asked Senator Bruno at the time and Speaker Silver to bring the troops back in August, which, that's the vacation period. It's also election year. And they agreed. And then eventually it was Senator Skelos who was there when they did come back. I made a speech to New Yorkers outlining the problems. And if you listen to that speech, it's very combative. And when I think about it now, they had already agreed to come back. So why was I being combative? Because I was still executing the playbook of Governor Spitzer, who liked being combative. Now, I was, I think, without trying to be overly self-promoting, very popular with the other legislators on both sides of the aisle. So the idea of me coming at them in this direction, I think, really hurt me because up to that point, I remember I got into an argument with Majority Leader Bruno one day, where he said that we were underestimating the revenues. I said, how could we be underestimating the revenues when I've just explained to you how the taxes are coming in lower than ever? You've got to be out of your mind. And it was a pretty terse conversation. And I was talking to my secretary to the governor at the time, Charles O'Byrne, and I said, I don't think I should have spoken to Senator Bruno that harshly. So he went to Senator Bruno's office to kind of extend an apology. And Senator Bruno said, he had to do that. We both know the revenues aren't going to be what they're supposed to be. He said, if I were him, I'd have said exactly the same thing. So that collegiality, I injured it by making that speech and kind of making it as if I was ordering them back. And I think they came back and they did what I asked them to do, but they didn't forget that I did that. And the lesson I learned is that if you come into authority in a situation, you've got to get a team around you that does things the way you do them and interacts the way you interact. And until that time, the former Spitzer staff was going about things just the same way they had all along. And that's when I realized the first thing I should have done was to build the right team. And by the time I built the right team, I think some mistakes were made that we couldn't correct.
Yeah, but the whole question of executive power now, people, I think, sometimes look at what happened then and now say, like you said, oh, we went from the situation where people at the Rockefeller Institute were saying we're in the lowest quintile, and now people talk about how strong the executive budget process is in New York.
Yeah, I would have to say that the plan to put the governor in position where they can pass the budget pretty much whenever they want to has spared us, because in the 12 years since, in all 12, the budget was passed on time.
Right. And I think people often, this is my opinion, I'd be interested in what you think. I think people feel like it's somehow removed legislative power. I don't really think that's true. I think it's just brought people to the table in a way to get things done a little bit more efficiently than they might have been in the past. But I don't know what you think.
Well, I might not have known what I thought either, but I did have a conversation with my former counsel, Peter Kiernan, this morning. And he said one of the most important issues of the Silver versus Pataki case is that it didn't actually make new law. It sustained the law that was already there. It established the fact that the governor does have that power and that legislators have to worry about their districts. So what the Secretary Stimson, who always seemed to be at war, said 100 years ago is actually true, that it's very hard to have a country, to have a state with 215 leaders in it. There's one person that, if all else fails, has got to keep the state afloat. And I think that that it was the intent of the legislature when they reestablished the Constitution in 1926. And all the Silver versus Pataki case did was to affirm that. It was also affirmed by a public referendum in 2006, where the legislators tried to overturn the Silver Pataki decision through the ballot box, and it lost 2-1.
Yeah, significantly. It's really, to me, it was a fascinating period. So what's your view of, COVID was obviously a kind of very different than the financial crisis, but also led to kind of emergency kind of budget actions. You also had a situation where you had a governor having to leave office under extraordinary circumstances. What's your view of the current climate and how things have been working out?
So I think at the beginning of the COVID crisis, and both of the legislative leaders. I had, I think Mr. Hasty had been there for 3 years and Cousins had been there for 2 years or something like that. And they just pretty much deferred to the governor, who basically passed his own budget and was able to put his entire legislative agenda into the budget, which in that year I think was fine. It's probably a dangerous precedent if you tried to do it all the time. And all indications were that in 2021, he thought that he was going to do this again. And that's the budget that he put out. But his ancillary issues came up in March of 2021. And so at that point, the legislative leaders opportunistically, because budgeting is about power and politics is about power. The leaders realized that they could stop him just by saying they weren't going to go along with any of it. And so the leaders had a much greater role in passing the 2021-22 budget. Now we have Governor Hochul, who I think is, without much trouble, going to win her primary. And I think barring something extraordinary, will return as governor. I got some information from the controller's office that the available cash in the New York State coffers right now is $30 billion. I wish I had just been 12 years younger.
Can I give you a
Be governor now, because believe me, we could do a lot of good with $30 billion. So I think that with that amount of money outstanding, that the period right now, I think things will go accordingly. They will fight over a couple of issues, but they won't really be financial issues because they've got a tremendous amount of money. And it came from the beneficiary resources that came from Washington, and they also came from very high tax revenues that came in, more than what they actually asked for.
Mhm.
So they had, I mean, for me to actually have to say this, I think is almost like a punishment, because I never heard about an available dollar while I was governor.
No, and unfortunately, I could never tell you that. The most amazing part of the existing situation is we were always telling you about out-year budget gaps where revenues would not meet the spending that was planned for the future. The governor's budget this year said that there was not only imbalance with the significant revenues you talked about, but that it would be in balance for the foreseeable future, the next 4 years. So an interesting message, very different than what you were able to do.
I just want Governor Hochul to know if she ever wants to take a few months over, I'd be happy to step in, because you could run the government economically on autopilot right now.
It's interesting. You know, a little bit off the topic, but one of the things I don't know if people know about you, but you've talked about it a little today, you are a student of history and New York history. And that was always one thing that I was impressed by, is that you would always have some important fact from a prior administration or a prior period in New York, which you would bring to bear in conversations. Is that something you've always done? Is that an interest of yours?
I guess I've always been curious about when things happen and how things came to be. So for instance, when we're talking about the budget extender, the first governor that actually had to issue an extender when the budget was going to be late was Governor Carey. And the extender process was basically what his lawyer thought that day. But it was implemented by the legislature. They needed some extra time to pass the budget. They weren't even fighting in 1981. They just physically could not get all of the work done in the requisite period of time. What they used to do in the Senate and Assembly was when they got to 11:59 on March 31st, they'd stop the clock. And sometimes they'd stay there for 2 days,
Right.
the longest minute ever, and until they're ready to pass the budget. And then that's when, you know, it seemed a little farcical and the media was making fun of them. And Governor Carey thought, well, why don't we just extend the government for a week and then we can get it done. And that's how they accomplished that.
Yeah, and it ended up in situations where you're right that the budget would float all the way out till the summer, and then you lived through the year when they actually had to come back in October and finish.
In 2001, September 11th, we had basically had the structure of the budget in August, and the legislators were upset because, people plan time off and that kind of thing. And so we'll come back and do it right at the beginning of September, but the beginning of September was the terrible attack on our country. And we did not actually finish until October 24th. And it was just so disgraceful that we were doing this. And it didn't seem to bother the legislators that we went on and on and on. And what they actually started doing was they let the legislators borrow the money that they would have gotten, because we had a rule that Governor Pataki had put in that if the budget wasn't passed, we didn't get paid until it got passed.
Right.
And it was so funny because you see all these legislators, they can't send their staff. It's their money. They're all online in front of the key bank, trying to get loans out to sustain this process. But even when the budget went 3 and 4 months late, no one wanted to do anything about it. And that's why I think the framers of our state constitution and those who have added to that wisdom over the years have always felt that it is much easier when one person becomes responsible. So I was responsible in 2010 to close down this fight where the legislature wouldn't close the budget. And we were able to come up with a way of doing it that had not been done before. And the good thing now is the public doesn't have to be grousing about the fact that the budget's late, because the budget really has not been late since 2006. It was the last time the budget was truly late. Sometimes there was an extra day once because one of the legislators was in the hospital and they didn't have a quorum. But it's 2006 is the last time we had any significant delay in the budget.
So I think you deserve more credit for that process than I think people know about now. What have you been doing since? Well,
if I told you, you wouldn't believe me, but I am currently the senior vice president of the Las Vegas Sands Corporation.
Really?
Probably the only person that has ever worked for a casino and has actually never gambled in one. But they are interested in one of the downstate licenses that will become available in 2023. But Governor Hochul and the legislature seem to be possibly pushing this to 2022 so they can add to their enormous amount of revenues. And the whole idea is when you're a Las Vegas casino and you come to New York, you kind of have to understand how people do things in New York. So they were talking about the great benefits of how they're non-union in Las Vegas. And I told them, you can. Well, what did they say? What happens in Las Vegas stays there. When you come to New York, don't even raise that subject. And then also on the issue of MWBE, should a license become available, I'm going to set up the program so that qualified businesses owned by women or African Americans or Hispanics or Asians will get a chance to be there. And I don't know that anybody else has set up that kind of format. And so it's been very exciting doing that. I had a radio program on WOR for a while now. I do one on WABC from time to time. So it's great to hear what the public thinks.
You take questions?
Yeah, I take questions. So that's been, pretty exciting. And then I was always, one of the problems that I always noticed when I was a state senator, and then I, noticed it when we had regional offices when we were governor was that people would come into these offices and not all of them speak English. So I kind of have gotten involved in the whole language translation issue. And now how quickly it can be done, where they have companies that they just have an iPad, they turn it on and ask for translation in like Serbo-Croatian, and within a minute, somebody can come on and actually do that. And that's really helping people in legislative offices or in the waiting rooms of hospitals and that kind of thing. So that was one of the services that I kind of got in on the ground floor. So there always seems to be something of some interest, and it's exciting to watch the process, particularly from outside of it.
You mentioned MWBE, and I know the Governor Hochul, has been talking about, diversity in the workforce and her administration. But you kind of lived through a long period of time politically. Do you think we're making progress? What do you think still has to happen?
I think that one of the sadder moments for me is I went to Albany to the Black, Asian, and Hispanic Legislative Caucus in 2017. And it was the first time I'd been back since 2010. And I went to all the events, and the thing that struck me is I met very few people that I didn't know before. So if these programs were working, I would think that there would have been more recipients of the benefits coming to these types of events. And what I think has happened is, some ways, the attempts to increase the opportunities for minority and women-owned businesses have actually impaired them. So for instance, even right now, if you have the certification to do MWBE for the Port Authority, and you then wanted to go to the Transit Authority, now you're in a different agency. And the MTA is going to make you go through a whole new recertification process. So it's almost as if we have created hardship for the minority companies that the regular companies don't have. I think we have to move out of the realm of apprenticeship to partnership, not necessarily 50-50 at first, but where some of these minority firms that have proven they can do excellent work will be part of the share in terms of the investment that the larger major companies are engaging in when they bid before the state. I think if we can do that, then you will see more jobs available in Black and Hispanic communities, and you'll also see the dollar circulating in those neighborhoods more times before it leaves.
Yeah. I mean, I struggled with this often when I was at the tax department and even at the Thruway after I left budget, is that, it was a kind of arduous process to bring on MWBE firms, and often, again, they would, folks were falling through the cracks because they didn't have the partnerships with the bigger firms.
Right.
So it's an interesting point that you're making. So again, what the political climate today? What's your opinion? And thank you. And by the way, thank you again for all the time you spent with us today.
Well, I think we're in a period of such acrimony between the parties. And I think we've really seen it play out in terms of the virus. So for instance, a lot of people who have a conservative political point of view, I think are unnecessarily ascribing some of the COVID protocols to liberal left-wing thinking, when what it really is medical institutional thinking. It's always been hard to get some of the medical institutions to change. So for instance, back in the 60s, Dr. Linus Pauling, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics, started experimenting with vitamin C. He was ridiculed by the medical community to such a point that they actually suggested that he was suffering from Alzheimer's. that he wasn't the same person that he was before. Now, you can buy vitamin C in doctors' offices. They sell vitamins. They claim that the body regenerates its own vitamins, which was a total myth that, was ascribed to them in medical school, and they never changed. And I'm not just blaming the medical community. There's a lot of institutionalization in other areas. And I think in this case, it's getting in the way. The same way people who have a very progressive political point of view think that the way to execute better law enforcement is to defund the police department. Well, they really have no knowledge of history, because in 1991 and 1992, Mayor David Dinkins, at the height of the fiscal crisis, of the crime crisis in New York, where over 2,000 people were being murdered per year, he was able to get the federal government to send 6,000 new police officers. He overfunded the police department, and the crime started to drop. I know you don't want to hear this, Mayor Giuliani, under the Dinkins administration in 1992 and in 1993. It dropped prohibitively under Giuliani as well, but the 6,000 police officers never showed up until 1994, when Giuliani was in office. But I think that the people who think you're going to solve the crime problem by in some way blaming it all on law enforcement are out of line. What they are not recognizing is that the same institutional problem that occurred with the medical institutions has also occurred in law enforcement. And now they are retraining the police officers. The terrible killing of Amadou Diallo in 1999 came because those police officers did not realize that if you ask someone to stop, you have to let the person identify themselves. And that's what happened. He took out his wallet. They thought it was a gun, and they shot him because they weren't trained correctly. And they were acquitted, and a lot of people were upset. And I don't know whether they should have been acquitted or not, but I felt sorry for those officers, because when they realized they had shot the man, they were in tears. They didn't mean to do it, but now we have the type of training that I think will enhance law enforcement. And guess what? If you're going to clean up any agency or any area of the government, you're going to have to spend more money doing it.
Thank you. Well, any other final comments? And again, I want to thank you for doing this, but on either your governorship or on what you're seeing today, or on the fiscal, on how you helped solve the fiscal crisis back in the 2008, 9, 10 period, which lives on.
Well, the great thing, at one time a political advisor said to me that a good ethical decision will inevitably be a good political decision. So when I think about the temptation at times to just go along with what the legislature wanted and leave the budget gap, if I had done that, it would have set a precedent that we were no longer going to even worry about the illusion of balancing the budget, and that the problem would actually get worse. I think what we actually did forced the legislature and the governor to clean up their acts and be ready and negotiate and settle the issues on time. I'm very proud of that. In terms of those who are in government now, it's very difficult because we're in a very acrimonious climate, and we are not always listening to each other as much as we're reacting to each other. And I don't envy the situations that the current mayor of the city and the governor of the state and the president of the United States and even the leaders on both sides of the aisle have to confront when it's very hard to bring them to the table. What I remember negotiating with the late Senator Joe Bruno, he was on the opposite aisle, is that regardless of what the difference of the opinions were and times when we raised our voices, that by the next day we could sit down, the apologies were accepted, and we learned to move on. And that's how we operated. I'll never forget that the the majority leader had promised me that he was going to increase the discretionary member items back in the day. And I did what I was supposed to do to receive that. And then he didn't do it. And when we were running out of time negotiating, a staff member of mine told the majority that we would agree not to take that money anymore. I don't know why a staff member would take it upon themselves to do that,
Right.
but they did.
Ex-staff member?
Yes. And so finally, I went to see Senator Bruno, and I thanked him for all the meetings we had. He said, "We're not going to have any more meetings?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Why?" I said, "Because when I made promises to you, I made them happen. No staff member made them happen. I made them happen. And in this case, you all listened to a staff member who didn't have the authority, and you knew it, to even make that kind of situation. So from now on, I'm just going to meet with your staff." And I actually got up to leave the room, wishing that he'd tell me to sit down again. And fortunately for me, he did. And he said, "I am going to give you the money we were supposed to give you, and I am going to step out of my role as Republican majority leader, and I'm going to be a Democratic consultant for 1 minute." And I said, "Sure, go ahead." And he said, "If you don't get rid of the person that allowed that to happen, you should not stay as minority leader." And I immediately did that, and we moved on. But the point was that even across the aisles, we understood each other and we could work together. And I'd like to see a little more of that. Certainly, it looked that way last night at the president's State of the Union address. And I thought the Republicans understood the need for all of us to be Americans. That night, we can go back to fighting over which is the right way to deal with the Ukraine today, but at least in a moment when we needed it, everybody stood together.
Thank you. So again, thank you, Governor
Thank you,
Paterson,
Bob.
for
I
doing
enjoyed
this.
this.
Oh, I enjoyed it too. And maybe we can invite you again, because we love your insights on these issues and your knowledge of the history of New York State, which I think is a rare thing today.
Well, thank you so much.